everyone. Welcome to another book review Wednesday, and today I'm going to be diving into something a little bit more general, like I did last week when I discussed college books. But for this week, I'm going to briefly talk about comic books. Yes, comic books have had a drastic influence on media over the years. They have spawned a variety of different creations. Primarily, at least nowadays, comic books are part of sort of the superhero genre. In other words, um, at least a lot of what comic books started as were influenced sort of by creating these kinds of superheroes, and I'll sort of dive into how that kind of came about. But the interesting thing is that comic books actually started uh, relatively earlier than might be expected. It is believed that in 1842, uh, the adventures of Mr. Obadiah Oldbuck were considered to be the first of comic books. So this really wasn't, I guess, a recent phenomenon, but it sort of kind of circulated in and out over the years. Um, and it really wasn't until 1938 when it really kind of became sort of an industry. Um, and that has largely to do with Superman. Now, I will say that I think Superman is an overrated superhero. I don't think he's that great, and I don't think he's that interesting of a superhero, but what Superman as comic books did is it brought light to this whole concept of giving um, these kinds of characters that we end up seeing later on within various other comic books. Um, so uh, this really started with Jerry Siegel and Joe Shutter's first Superman. And basically, this was when we're given sort of an age of comics, and in this case, the golden age of comics, which sort of lasted throughout sort of the 40s and 50s. And then we get eventually into the silver age of comics, which is within the 60s and 70s. And within that era, we get Marvel Comics. And this is when you sort of see Stan Lee's work in particular shine, um, and also other comic book artists as well that were sort of under that Marvel umbrella. And um, the first at least that were to come out were Fantastic Four as well as Spider-Man, and then eventually you get sort of a spiral of all of these different kinds of comic books that were again primarily generated on producing superheroes. um, and uh, Obviously there were more alternative comic books that have spawned over the years, more famously within the 1970s, and usually those were relatively more risque and a lot more adult than the more mainstream comic books of the time. Um, and I think this could have been a sort of similar response that we saw in the 70s with animation, and that animation started getting a little bit more adult and a little bit more underground and risque. Um, but again, it sort of has a parallel here. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're connected per se, but at the same time, they were sort of having similar ideas going around as far as how to kind of push the envelope and make things a little bit less mainstream. Um, and uh, Really, what we have now, at least, is sort of a lot of these comic books being generated into filmmaking and making a significant amount of money doing so. So we have Disney that basically owns Marvel now, And I believe, though, except the X-Men series, I think is still technically owned by Fox, if I'm not mistaken. And then we have DC, which is the other universe of comic books that include the more, I think you could say, traditional superheroes, because we have Superman and Batman, which were more of the beginning, again, comic book characters. So uh, it is quite fascinating to see how it evolved over the years. And the way in which they approach the whole visual aspect is quite interesting, because usually books are primarily designed for you to kind of comprehend material, um, more so with reading, whereas with comic books it was a lot more visual. Um, I think it's definitely appealed more so to the male demographic over the years. I think the visual aspect, I think, is also something that might have been something that maybe uh, draws, in particular, that demographic towards the comic books, only because uh, they uh, respond to visual, I think, more so, maybe than the female demographic. Also, comic book characters primarily had male protagonists, although they have had very responsive female protagonists that eventually would come out within various comic books. But it seemed like that throughout the years, it seems to maintain a more male demographic over female. Um, but again, obviously that may or may not be changing depending. But at the same time, uh, there is still this uh, emphasis within our culture with these particular comic books, and sometimes you'll see people that are very devoted to these books, and you sort of see people who are also really not familiar with the comic books, but then they'll go see the films that are sort of based off of the comic books. I usually fall into the latter category, only because even though I appreciate comic books and I think they are a great form of artistry, I didn't really necessarily get into reading them. Um, Only because I think a lot of the stories, um, again, they kind of have, they follow similar, again, storylines, and I think that's sort of a flaw with a lot of comic books is that they take a lot of similar elements and put them into a lot of comic books. Um, but it's definitely a medium that I appreciate more so than I personally find enjoyable or appealing, I guess you could say. Um, and it'll be nice to see what entertainment can come out of comic books. Obviously, we've seen various video games being developed based on comic books, and we're obviously seeing that heavily emphasized within film and even giving it its sort of own genre. Um, and it still, I think, sort of remains to be seen where comic books will eventually go. I think that there has been so many different ones that have been generated over the years that it sort of makes sense to kind of take the entertainment that they provided and take it sort of to that next level and incorporate it under forms of media like video games and movies. And definitely there's going to be that fan base that'll find enjoyment out of a movie uh, based upon a comic book, or depending on whether or not how consistent that comic book is, maybe to the movie. But I mean, I've been one of those people that really doesn't care, just as long as, I like to judge a film based upon itself rather than what it's really based upon, more so. But I think it's a interesting part of the whole entertainment industry, and it probably will continue along that route. Um, I think it's kind of unfortunate because I think some superheroes have sort of oversaid their welcome. For example, I think there have been already numerous films done about Spider-Man, and then they already want to reboot it again, and then or we have to redo Superman now, and then we have to redo Batman again. I almost feel like they need to explore other superheroes and put them more in the spotlight because there is an extensive library. And I don't understand why Hollywood doesn't utilize that because there's a lot of potential there for people to get excited over certain characters. And I think some parts, some areas they're trying to do that. And really bring life to these characters that have come out of the pages of these comic books. Um, but it's definitely one that sort of remains to be seen. But I think that's really ultimately all I can say about comic books. There's sort of a whole kind of huge fan base really dedicated to this kind of material. Comic-Con, again, very popular. So if you're into all of that, there's, comic books and Comic-Con in particular will have you sort of covered as far as that's concerned. But I think that's really all I can say about them. If there are any questions, comments, concerns, I'd be more than happy to answer them. But thank you so much for watching. I hope you all have a pleasant day, week, month, and year, and I hope to see you all in the next video.